Thank you, Natasha, again. Round of applause. And so we're going to go on to our next talk, which is from Courtenay Norbury, Sarah Griffiths, and Laura Lucas. So Courtenay Norbury is a professor of developmental disorders of language and communication at UCL. She's also a qualified speech and language therapist. Prior to this, she was a professor at the Department of Psychology in Royal Holloway. Today, she's talking about the longitudinal scale study. She's joined by Sarah Griffiths and Laura Lucas. Sarah is a research associate for scales. She completed her PhD at the University of Bristol, and after this worked with Simon Barron Cohen at Cambridge. And Laura Lucas is a research assistant for scales and has a background in psychology and an MSc in developmental disorders. So I'll hand over to them for the presentation.
Okay, I hope you can all hear me. Thanks for joining. And we are all going to try and have a part in this talk because Scales is very much a team effort, and Sarah and Laura have some unique insights that I think are really important. So Laura's in control, and she's going to go to the next slide now. So Scales is a longitudinal study. It started a decade ago when I was younger and the world was a different place. It's a huge study that is tracking language and cognitive development over quite a diverse group of children. We started when they were in reception. They're now in year 8, time flies. And we're really interested in children who are not learning language in the typical sort of way. So we have quite a wide variety of language abilities, cognitive abilities, social abilities in our cohort. We use combinations of questionnaires, standardized language and cognitive assessment, and some experimental tasks. And in the first 3 years of the study, or the first phase of the study, I should say, we did all of that using pencil and paper versions. And you can see from the numbers there, that was quite a massive undertaking. And even from the most practical point of view of where you store all of this data, it was a real headache. But we also had to pay someone to enter all the paper and pencil versions into data sheets. And this was just craziness. So when we came to renew the grant and to look at the kids when they were moving from primary school into secondary school, we decided that we really needed to move to an online testing platform to make this a more feasible adventure. And that's when I got involved with Gorilla, and they've just been brilliant in helping us to do this. So being able to have it all online has been a lot more efficient and cheaper in the longer term because we can just collect data and save it as we're going along rather than having to rely on someone else to enter the data. This reduces error, and it's easier to have item level data for all measures. So for example, in year 1, our vocabulary scores are just the summary scores, whereas now in year 6 and year 8, we can have item level data for vocabulary tests. It's also made it a lot easier to share data and share tasks and materials. And one of the reasons that we were reluctant to do this in the beginning is because we were worried that going into schools, there might be issues getting online and collecting data online. But actually, that's proved to be really straightforward and simple. So that was fine, and it's worked really well. But I have to say that we have been in schools and we've been with the kids as we've been testing them up until this year. So on the next slide, what I'm going to do is just tell you some of the issues that are involved with putting standardized assessments on something like Gorilla. And Laura's going to move us along. So the main thing to know is that you have to get permission from the publishers, and some aren't so happy to do that. They'd rather you bought into their own platforms, and it isn't cheap. So test companies make most of their money from the test forms that people use. So they charge you quite a lot of money to put it online, but it's worth it because it's much easier. If, like me, you're really interested in clinical diagnoses, you have to be aware that you can't really use the published standard scores. They don't apply because you're delivering it in quite a different way. But because scales are so big, we can look at standardization within the sample. And so that's what we've done. We don't use the published standard scores, we use our own norms. In some ways, it's interesting because it does make the presentation of the test more standard because you can record the items in advance. So if you have lots of testers, I think that makes it better because you are delivering it in a more standard way. One of the issues with standardized tests is they have stopping and starting rules depending on how the kids are doing. And that was a difficult nut to crack. That took a while, but Gorilla did it. So we can now start kids at various points, and if they get things wrong, move them up and down as you need to be. And just to reiterate, we have had testers with the kids, and that's been really useful because it allows us to pace the tasks, to answer any questions they have, and to change the order of how we present tasks depending on how much time we've got, how the kids are doing, and what the distractions are in the environment. So that's standardized tests, and I'm going to hand over to Sarah for a few minutes, who's going to tell you more about the platform and the experimental tasks.
Okay, so we've been using Gorilla for 2 of our testing time points. For the first one, we only had a few of our experiments on Gorilla, and we had them set up as individual experiments. So for each one, you had to have a different link, and you had to enter the participant's ID number each time. When we came to setting up the next phase, when the children were in year 8, Gorilla helped us to set up this testing platform sort of dashboard system. So you only log in once, you only enter the participant's ID once, and then you have all of the tasks. We've got 8 different tasks in Gorilla this time. And this allows you to sort of select which one you want to do. So as Courtney said, it's very flexible in terms of the order that you give the task, which is important for us. It will also allow you to restart a task, and it will save both versions, which can be useful if you're, for example, if the sound isn't working and you have to want to restart the task with that child. So yeah, this really improved the ease of administering lots of different tasks at the same time. So now I'm just going to tell you about just 4 of the tasks that we've set up. So as Courtney said, we have a mixture of standardised tests and more experimental tests that we're using. The top 2 are both examples of standardised tests. We've got a standardised vocabulary test. This is a receptive vocabulary test. So the child hears a word that's recorded. So it's very standardised. They always hear exactly the same recording each time. They can replay the recording. There's a little replay button at the bottom, and then they just select which picture they think matches the word. So this is the child can basically do this completely independently. The way we've been doing it is that the experimenter is there with the child, but at this age, most of the children can just sort of listen to this through headphones and do it very independently. The next one along the top is the Carson Coulthart reading test. This is a task that we put onto Gorilla this time because it's one of the ones we were doing on pencil and paper, and we had to copy across the responses, which is quite a time-consuming job. But this isn't something the children can do independently because this is a expressive task. They read the word out loud, and then the experimenter has to mark whether or not that's correct or not. And as I said, when we started doing this, when we designed this, we were doing face-to-face testing, even though we were collecting our data through Gorilla online. So the experimenter would input the response. So we had a right click if it was incorrect and a left click if it was correct. And this is a mouse click response. And the reason we had it as a mouse click response is because we wanted to be able to, the experimenter to be able to input this without the child getting any indication of whether they were correct or incorrect. So we have wireless mice, and the experimenter would hold that underneath the table. So that's an example of a test where you really need the experimenter to be there live with the child, even if it's remote, but it's still really useful to be doing it online. The bottom 2 are experimental tasks. The one on the left is a really nice task for testing receptive grammar. So this little robot is quite gamified. There's a robot here, a video of a robot who's saying some sentences, and they're either correct, they've either got good grammar or bad grammar, and the child has to tell the robot whether or not they're getting it right for each sentence. The nice thing about this task is it was developed by Alexander Wilson and Dorothy Bishop in Oxford, and they have already created this task on Gorilla. So when we decided we wanted to include this in our battery, it was really easy to add that into our dashboard. We made a few tweaks to it, but otherwise it was pretty much ready to go. So that was great. And the final one, that's another experimental task that we programmed ourselves, which is about recognizing emotions in sounds and from faces. So that just gives you a little taste of the kinds of tasks that we were doing online in face-to-face sessions. And now I'm going to hand over to Laura, who is going to tell you how this, in some ways, this sort of set us up really well for moving online for COVID.
Thank you. So when COVID-19 hit the UK, we were about halfway through our planned data collection. So it was our 4th wave of data collection, and all the children were in year 8 at school. We obviously knew the possibility of us going back into schools before the next academic year were quite slim, meaning that we would have had to put a stop to data collection completely, which is why we have opted for taking the assessments entirely online. And this has been beneficial in us being able to continue data collection, at least to some extent. So we wanted to keep our assessments as similar to the one-to-one assessments that we do with the child in school as we could. So we decided that a video call with the child would be the best way of doing this. This is also helpful because we do have quite a large battery of tasks, and some do involve talking and discussions, as Sarah mentioned, and this works really well on a video call. And it also allows us to take control in loading the tasks ourselves, so the children don't need to take control of any of that. And we can monitor the child's engagement with the tasks, and it's also an opportunity for them to ask us any questions that they have along the way whilst they're taking part. So there are several different platforms that you can use. We've actually been using Zoom. We just found that it had less technical problems than some of the other platforms that we tried, such as Teams. And Zoom allows us to use the screen share function. We can give the children remote control of our computer, so they can then sort of use our mouse to respond. And we can also record both audio and video responses as needed. So as Sarah said, as most of the tasks were already set up online, the process was actually quite simple in moving entirely online from doing the assessments in a school environment. And it's actually allowed us more flexibility in terms of the testing schedule, because school schedules are quite restricted, and they're obviously mostly like 9 till 3 till 3:30. And now we have a longer period of time in which to do the assessments, so we can test from 9 till 5. And we are flexible around the children's new timetables whilst they're working at home. So as children are now regularly using computers to complete their schoolwork, most of them are highly skilled in being able to engage with the tasks. But it is worth noting that the families that have responded and agreed to taking part in the assessments online tend to be those where the child can be left to work independently and don't need supervision or assistance. So whilst the transition to online testing has been fairly successful for scales at the moment, there are some things to consider if you are thinking about taking your assessments online. So firstly, there are some tasks that you might not be able to take online, whether this be for practical reasons or for licensing type reasons, as Courtney suggested before. And if you have been conducting tasks in person, some tasks might require slight changes to put them online. So for instance, we have a writing task. Well, when we were in schools, we had a written task that the children completed, and now they type their answers into a box instead. So when we're analysing the data, we need to take this into account because some of the tech-savvy children know how to use a spell checker, so you wouldn't be able to analyse it for spelling errors, which we would be able to do with a written task. Obviously, online testing is reliant on good internet connection, and it can cause problems with the way in which certain tasks work. So you might not be able to scroll in the same way as you expect, or you might not be able to type into a box the way that you expect to be able to. And it can also cause problems in communication between you and the participant if the connection isn't very good. So whilst the children are familiar with engaging with schoolwork online, A lot of the assessments are done after a long day of schoolwork, and the children can be quite tired, and it can be quite tricky to get them to engage properly. But also, due to the longitudinal nature of scales, our families have been very keen to be involved in the project, and we do think that it might be slightly more difficult for new projects to recruit people in this way. One last thing to consider is that when children are working, the children who have more difficulties in taking part from home might need parental assistance, and whilst it is more tricky for to monitor and control the engagement from the parent, because we're on a video call, we are able to remind them not to intervene with the assessment.
Okay, so now for the major caveat. When we set up this year for our last phase of data collection, we were targeting 391 kids, and you can see the split here was 279 kids with typical language and 111 with DLD. And when we had to abandon school testing, we had seen 190 of those children, and we had perfectly even recruitment in both of those groups. Now, since COVID, bearing in mind we had some time where we had to get ethics permission to move things online and then track down all the kids via the schools because of GDPR issues, Laura and the testing team have managed to see 46 children online, which is brilliant, better than we maybe hoped we would do. But you can see there's very big differences in the populations that we're able to test online. So we've seen 24% of the target typical group, but only 3% of the DLD group. And also, we're still far off our desired target. So there's 155 children we won't be able to see. Perhaps not surprisingly, but it is a little bit stressful for people like me who are interested in children who aren't developing as you might expect. There is systematic bias in response. So we're seeing children who have better language skills, who can work independently, who do not have special educational needs. And we're also seeing families from more affluent neighborhoods and not those who might be experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. And the biggest issue is really getting people to respond to our email invitations, so that level of engagement. But sometimes even when they want to, it's difficult to organize because they don't have access to computers, internet, or the child needs support that parents aren't able to offer in the time that we can do it. And so just to summarize on our last slide. Yeah, so first of all, a big thank you to Gorilla for supporting us and for this day. You can do it. The online testing platform has streamlined our activities. We can share tasks and procedures. A lot of them are done now, and we're happy to share what we can. In my opinion, personal interaction with the kids is pretty paramount for success, and I'm lucky to have such a wonderful team. My major concerns for the future is that fully online testing yields a poorer response rate overall and systematic response in that bias. And that means it's much harder to see the families and young people we most want to see represented in our research. And I think that's a big issue that maybe we can all try and tackle together, how we get that engagement from a wider variety of young people. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.